So this is module 15, which we're going to be talking about adolescence. Some of you might still be at the tail end of adolescence. Others of you may have the benefit of a few years out. I can tell you now, as I approach middle age, you look back in your adolescence and you think, oh my goodness, what was I thinking? So the next phase of development. Developmental psychologists traditionally used to focus attention only on childhood, but then we started looking at it now more from a lifespan perspective, and we look at development as a lifelong process. So the next phase in the process after childhood, is adolescence. And adolescence is actually kind of a critical period because it's the transition from childhood to adolescence, and it's the period ranging from puberty to independence. So looking on the left, would you think that those children are adolescents yet? To me, they don't look like they are. I think they're trying to be. I remember when I was a kid, you want to grow up faster than you should. But adolescence used to not be studied so much too, because it was seen that historically after childhood people became adults because they would be required to go out into the fields and do farming work, and so there wasn't really this luxury of this period of transition that we now have. So in terms of physical development, puberty is the time of sexual maturation where people become physically able to reproduce. And during puberty there's a lot of increased sex hormones, which explains a lot of adolescent behavior. Primary and secondary sex characteristics start to develop. You'll see changes in mood and behavior. These are a little bit more sometimes pronounced in girls in the earlier years as they kind of transition 13 through 16. You also see big changes in heights. So while they're smaller, girls may be the same size or sometimes even taller than boys, they kind of level off after about the age of 13, 14 when they hit puberty, whereas boys keep growing until about the age of 18. So the primary sex characteristics are our reproductive organs, and our secondary sex characteristics are body hair, changing voice, etc. So you can see in the diagrams, you probably learned these in your health classes, that women begin to menstruate, they're enlarged, the uterus becomes enlarged, the ovaries start growing, and the secondary sex characteristics are development of pubic hair, underarm hair, and then the voice deepens, you get facial hair, so all those lovely things. So the sequence of maturation is predictable, but the time of onset varies from person to person. We're seeing now that people are going through puberty at younger and younger ages, but the ages can vary anywhere from kind of 10 to 15 for a girl to start menstruating, for example. Maturing early can have social advantages and also increases expectations and risks. So if you look older, people expect you to behave older when you might be chronologically still very young. During puberty, the brain stops automatically adding new connections and becomes more efficient at rewiring. So the connections are not being added, but the connections between the existing connections are being multiplied. And the ones that are not being used are kind of pruned away, so there's not a lot of excess stuff going on there. So the ones that are really well used are coated with a lot of myelin, which allows the signals to go more quickly. It's kind of like the insulation, if you will. And this makes early adolescence a crucial time to learn as much as you can. So the frontal lobes, those are the ones that are kind of in charge of our ability to control our impulses and our mood and emotion sometimes. Those are the last to rewire. And so while adolescents may understand risks and consequences, there's still that thrill-seeking behavior. And I read this really cool article about sentencing juveniles as adults called Not Guilty by Reason of Adolescence, and just showing that teens really, even though you can understand logically right from wrong, there's this kind of this emotional level that it's not really understood. In terms of cognitive development, Jean Piaget felt that adolescents were in the formal operation stage, so they can think about how reality compares to ideals. So you might think about when you're a kid going and living in a castle, but then you might start to understand what the reality of actually being a prince or princess means. You can start thinking hypothetically about different choices and their consequences, so weighing pros and cons. You might start to learn how to pursue goals, and then you start to think about what others think of you, and if you're Like I was as a teenager, you think excessively about what others think about you, and it almost paralyzes you at some points. So as in teenagers, you're also building toward moral reasoning, and so you're seeing adolescents see justice and fairness in terms of merit and equity instead of in terms of everyone getting equal treatment. And that's why you'll see a lot of adolescents start to become active in different causes. They start to advocate for ideals and political causes. They think about God, meaning, purpose in deeper terms than you would in childhood. So according to Kohlberg, who talked about moral reasoning, there's kind of what's called pre-conventional morality, which is up to age 9, and you follow rules because if you don't, you'll get in trouble. And I have to say, sometimes I still do that. Then there's conventional morality, which transpires in early adolescence, and you follow the rules because we get along better if everyone does the right thing. So you're not doing it because you don't want to get in trouble, but you're doing it because it's kind of the right thing to do. And then post-conventional morality is this one. Sometimes rules need to be set aside to pursue higher principles. So this is kind of where you have to weigh the pros and cons of following the rules. Like, for example, if your significant other is in labor and there are red traffic lights and she's yelling at you that she's about to give birth, you might have to run through those traffic lights because you need to get to the hospital quicker. For example, looting after a natural disaster, which level of moral reasoning is involved there? So if we were going back to our 3 levels, the pre-conventional morality would be that we have to follow the rules, so that we would not do that because it's wrong. Conventional morality would be that we would try to all help one another. And post-conventional morality might suggest that in order to survive, we may have to take things that don't belong to us. So, obviously it's a problem, but if your family's survival is at stake, you might need to do it. Moral intuition. Jonathan Haidt believed by moral decisions are often driven by moral intuition, that is, quick gut feeling decisions. So it's not really just based in moral reasoning, but also in emotions like disgust. So we turn away from choosing an action because it feels awful, and elevated feelings that we might get rewarding delight for some moral behavior, such as donating to charity. So here's an example. So given a hypothetical choice to save 5 people from an oncoming trolley by killing 1 person, many people's choice is determined not just by reasoning but by disgust. Many people would flip a switch to make this choice, but not many would push a person onto the tracks to save 5 other people. So, while it might logically make sense to do that, who's going to kill somebody to save 5 other people? So moral action, doing the right thing. So you want to do kind of character education. So how do you kind of teach somebody how to become moral? You teach them empathy, self-discipline, delaying gratification, so being able to wait for larger goals instead of taking the smaller ones, and experience serving others, so having people volunteer and feel what that's like. And that's kind of how we build morality in young people. So social development, according to Erik Erikson, he very much modeled the lifelong psychosocial development. And he sees the adolescence as a struggle to form an identity, as a sense of self. And so that's kind of why you see so much exploration, and you see the picture on the right, experimenting with different types of fashions, hair color, piercings, etc., tattoos, because this is where you're trying to figure out who you are and where you belong. So adolescents are actually trying out different selves with peers, parents, and teachers. And so the challenge, according to Erikson, in adolescence is to test and integrate the roles that you're trying out in order to prevent role confusion. So you have to find, which of these ones is truly me, and am I really the jock? Am I really the artsy person? Am I really, independent? Who am I? And some teens simply solve this problem by adopting one role defined by their parents or peers. So their parents decide for them, but then that sometimes becomes problematic later on. So you want to obviously, adhere to the morals and values set forth by your family and friends, but at the same time figure out who you are unto yourself. So these were Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. They're outlined in your textbook. So there's infancy, toddlerhood, preschool, elementary school, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. And then these are the different issues. So trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, competency versus inferiority. And so here in adolescence, you have identity versus role confusion, where the teenagers work at refining a sense of self by testing roles and integrating them to form a single identity, or they become confused about who they are. So While adolescents are currently in the identity versus role confusion stage, they've just finished working through the tension of competence versus inferiority. And then toward the end of adolescence, you start talking about intimacy versus isolation. This is kind of where you're pairing off and finding your kind of your mate. So, what are our influences in our identity? Parent and peer relationships. So, while we depend very much on our parents during our first 12 years of life, parents usually report that they never see their kids once they become adolescents because their friends take such a center stage. And I remember when I was a teenager thinking about, that my friends really were my family and almost abandoning my family for my friends. However, adolescents still see their parents as influences in many areas like career, religion, politics. This is kind of a difficult, road for parents to navigate because you want to be there for your child, but you also want to give them the independence. So you can look on the right there. There's a table or graph, sorry, which shows the percentage with positive, warm interactions with parents in terms of children's ages, and you can see that it kind of goes down as they head into adolescence. While my children are still a little ways away, I do have to tell you that I am not looking forward to that period. So now we talk a lot about in psychological literature emerging adulthood. So this is kind of the years between 18 and 25. If you look at the cartoon on the right, it said when I was your age, I was an adult. So now, we've extended adolescence to even kind of, the early 20s because a lot of people are still not financially able to move out of their houses when they're 18. People aren't getting married until much later. So everything has kind of been pushed back. And so now we have this phase that, as I said, has been called emergent.